The most important thing we can do to eliminate noise at capture, or at least reduce it in the given conditions, is to always ensure that you're exposed correctly, spot on. And if anything, push that exposure a little bit to the right. In other words, brighten it up for the given conditions. And try not to do that by bumping the ISO, because raising the ISO on some cameras can introduce noise to the shots, but not on all cameras. So check out the specs of your particular camera. The best way to brighten up an image is to actually add light to the scene. So attempt to use a reflector, think about using an LED or a flash, and if you can't do that, then think about using a tripod, making your camera nice and steady so that you can increase the shutter duration, so you've got a longer exposure to introduce light and signal into your scene. All of that is going to reduce the noise in your capture. And if you can't do that, open up the aperture, bathe your sensor in light. That'll brighten the exposure up. And finally, if you have to handhold, make sure you've got your in-body image stabilization or your image stabilization turned on in your camera so you can keep the shutter open as long as possible. If your subject's going to be moving though, you've probably got no option but to bump the ISO a little bit. Don't worry. Do that. Raise your ISO. Don't worry about the noise. Just make sure that your exposure is perfect. Right. Having said that, you can also think about shooting in brighter conditions. Try to shoot in bright scenes. And if you can't do that, shoot your subject against brighter backgrounds, because noise appears and surfaces in the dark, murky shadows of a shot. So that's important. And then finally, try not to crop. Cropping destroys an image from a noise perspective, and I'll explain why later in this video. If you're anything like me and you're a nature photographer, you're going to be struggling with noise in a lot of the images you capture. And there's a good reason for that. It's not you, it's not me, it's the fact that we shoot out of doors in natural light. And that's a problem, because we can't generally add light to a scene. We have to take what we can get. And on bright sunny days and in bright conditions, we're going to get a lot of information streaming into our cameras, into the sensor, hitting that sensor and delivering a noise-free image. But on dark, dull days like today, where it's overcast, we're going to be straining the limits of our gear. There's not going to be enough light around, and those shadows are going to contain lots of noise. And there's only a few things we can do to prevent that. Before we head too far down this track, I think it's probably important that we define what noise actually looks like in our images. And wherever we're shooting on dark, dull days, we're at risk of some noise. And you'll start to see it in darker areas of the image. You'll start to see it particularly in out of focus areas, in backgrounds. And it's a blocky graininess that might detract from the image. And in really bad situations, it'll encroach into the photograph, come in over the in-focus areas, into the subject, and it'll obscure the clarity and the detail. It'll make the image possibly look a little bit soft and lacking in detail. That's what we're fighting against. That's what we're trying to prevent. Noise is a fundamental feature of the universe. It's a quantum feature of the universe, and we've known this since the early 1900s. In other words, we can never escape a certain level of noise. And any sensing equipment, like a camera, any image sensing equipment, is going to reach a level of detail at some point where it's impossible to distinguish the signal from the background noise. And that's what we need to battle with as the person using the camera, as the photographer. We need to try to emphasize that signal over the background noise so that we can actually capture a usable image. And there's lots of different ways we can do that by capturing light more efficiently. There's a tendency amongst photographers to dismiss noise as some kind of homogeneous mess that we have to deal with. In other words, that noise is always the same. That's not true. Noise is different. There's different types of noise, different characteristics of noise, and different causes of noise. And that's why it's important to identify the types of noise in your image, and therefore identify the ways we can mitigate them when we capture that image. As a generalist nature photographer, someone who takes photographs of landscapes, astro, nightscapes, wildlife and birds, my photographs suffer from all kinds of different noise. And the first of these is pattern noise. Pattern noise generally affects longer exposures, so anything from 30 seconds up to several hours. And the longer the exposure, the more pattern noise you'll start to see. And the causes are twofold. First off, your sensor is heating up over time and generating more of that pattern noise. And second off, the environment that you're shooting in might also be causing some of that noise. And it's typical, for instance, in nightscapes and astrophotography, those shots of the Milky Way above a landscape. That is particularly where we see pattern noise, and we'll see it in the hotter areas and the darker areas of the landscape. And it's caused by that heat radiating off the land into the sky. Your sensor's picking that up and showing it as bright white pixels, hot pixels, in your shots. The second kind of noise that we all suffer from, particularly wildlife and bird photographers, the most common type of noise that we complain about, is random noise. It's the difficulty in light-constrained conditions of extracting that signal information and making it distinct from that background chatter that's all around us. And it's typical in dawn and dusk conditions, dark light forest conditions, overcast days, anywhere where we shorten our shutter speed to capture movement, anywhere we narrow our aperture to get greater depth of field, and anywhere we pump up that ISO to compensate. The third type of noise is common to every photographer and every genre of photography, and that's because it's caused by the camera itself. Poor design, poor heat shielding, inefficiencies in software processing, all of that will contribute to it. And every camera will be slightly different, but some brands will suffer much more than others, some models much more than others. And it's probably fair to say that the more modern cameras suffer much less than the older cameras in this respect. And this noise will start to appear as some kind of patterning, particularly in areas where we lift shadows aggressively in post, or where we aggressively post-process an image. Some cameras are famous for it. For instance, the Canon 5D Mark III is famous for banding in the shadows. But there's other artifacts and other components of this noise. Sometimes you'll see a checkerboard pattern appear, all sorts of different types of noise radiating out from those components that are poorly designed or shielded in your particular camera. Now that we've got a good appreciation of the three main types of noise and what causes them, we need to discuss the characteristics of that noise too, because we treat them differently both when we capture and also when we process the image. The first and most important of these characteristics is the differentiation between color noise and luminance noise. Luminance noise affects the brightness and darkness of pixels, whereas color noise obviously affects the color of pixels, and they can exhibit in different ways. There are a few other components of noise that we need to understand as well. One of these is the magnitude of the noise, the size and the shape of it. Another is the spatial frequency, how tightly packed or how sparsely distributed the noise is. And a third is channel noise. Those of you who are familiar with how color photographs are made up will be aware that they're made up of red, green and blue colors, and these are described as the three color channels. And it might interest you to know that the blue color channel is particularly susceptible to noise and the green is least susceptible. So we can actually treat those color channels independently in our processing to reduce the impact of noise. We've talked a lot about the types of noise and the characteristics of noise, but not a lot about how to mitigate their effects on the image. And there's one main way we can do this. We can increase the brightness of our surroundings. We can do this by adding light or just shooting in brighter conditions. Those brighter conditions will just generally give us better signal information. It'll strike our sensor and it'll overwhelm any of the noise characteristics that are inherent in the camera and the general conditions. Bright environments make for great noise-free shots. That's step number one. Now obviously, as nature photographers and natural light photographers, we can't always do that. Sometimes we can use artificial lighting like flash. If we can't do that, we have to compensate in other ways. And one of the ways we can do that is by using the two controls that physically add light to our exposure. One is aperture and the other is shutter speed. If we need more light in our image to expose it correctly, we can do so by widening up that aperture, making the hole bigger, bathing our sensor in light, or alternatively by dropping our shutter speed and using a longer duration to actually achieve a brighter exposure. Those are crucial. Now obviously we can't always do that. And then we come to the third control in exposure, the ISO, the gain. And effectively what that does is it doesn't add any light to our shot. It's the only control we've got that doesn't add anything. All it does is increases the sensitivity. And when it does that, it's the same as increasing the volume on a loudspeaker. The loudness goes up, but at the same time, so does the noise floor. And you're more aware of the noise and the loudness of the signal, but also that noisy buzz in the background. ISO is the same as that. It works the same way with images. But there's an important consideration. Camera manufacturers these days have got quite canny and they've got brilliant designs. Some of them make use of something called a dual gain sensor, where the ISO resets itself at certain points in the scale and uses different signal information. Some of them have got great processing and computational algorithms behind the image which can reduce noise and eliminate noise. That's true of a lot of camera phones these days. So cameras are getting cleverer and better at eliminating noise. So you can contemplate turning up the ISO, but always start with either adding more light to the scene, adding a larger aperture, and reducing the shutter speed, and only use ISO to compensate as a last resort. Photography, as always, is about balancing those components to achieve an exposure. In digital photography, we obviously want to achieve a nice, balanced, even and representative exposure. But it's important to understand how the digital camera is working when it collects that light, that signal information. It's collecting far less in the darker areas of the image and far more in the bright areas of the image. And that means something. Where we have the latitude, where the image is not already too bright and it's not clipping over on the right side of that histogram, we can expose the entire image over to the right side of the histogram. And what that means is we're collecting far more information, signal information, from the scene in front of us, by simply overexposing the shot slightly at capture. And then what we can do is we can take that image, that overexposed image, onto our computer and dial that exposure down, and we'll get far finer detail, much less noise in our shot as a result. And all it takes from us is to manage exposure conservatively. We look at our histograms, we gauge our exposure, we ensure that we aren't clipping highlights, and at the same time we're lifting shadows in camera, preferably by using our two real light controls, aperture and shutter speed. But that doesn't mean we can't use ISO to manage exposure as well. Because if we brighten up an image by increasing our ISO, it doesn't always confer more grain and noise in that image. If we brighten it up and we expose it to the right side of the histogram, quite often when we reduce the exposure in post on our computer, we'll see less evidence of noise in those shadow areas than were we to have exposed it at a lower ISO. I was fascinated to learn, for instance, that tightly focused areas of an image exhibit much less noticeable noise than out of focus background areas. And if you think about that from a wildlife photographer's perspective, where we're using huge telephoto lenses in extensive areas out of focus, and often striving for that extreme shallow depth of field, perhaps with just the eye in focus on the animal, it actually makes sense to dial in more depth of field, because what it does is increases the spatial frequency of the noise, decreases its magnitude in the area that's in focus, and therefore increasing the depth of field over our subject will reduce the noticeable noise characteristics in our subject. While we're on the subject of lenses and how they can change the noise properties of an image, I think there's an important concept known as clear aperture area that we should discuss. And you may have noticed that on longer telephoto lenses the barrels are really large compared to shorter telephotos, but they still have the same f-stop. What's that about? Well, the f-stop, the f number, is actually a ratio. So for a shorter focal length you can have a smaller hole and the ratio will remain the same, let's say a 200mm f4. And if you took a 500mm f4, you might notice that the barrel is much bigger, and that physical size, the bigness of the hole, is bigger as well, but it still remains an f4. And they gather the same amount of light, but they do so in slightly different ways. The 200mm gathers light from a wide field of view, whereas the 500 gathers it from a narrow field of view and a massive hole. And that's how they work. And those confer different characteristics to the noise. So if I were to tightly frame something like a bird with my 500mm shot, I would get really high quality signal information through that big hole, that big aperture, striking my sensor. If I was to take the 200mm and shoot it at f4, and then I was to crop in post to the same framing as the 500, I would get much less quality signal information through onto my framed part of the sensor than I do with the 500, and the noise would be commensurately worse. So cropping in that 200 definitely destroys the quality of the image. It's much better to shoot that longer focal length in that situation. You gain advantages in noise characteristics simply by increasing the focal length and having a larger clear aperture area in those conditions. And that's very similar to what we experience in astrophotography. Because if you think about the night sky, you can capture it in two distinct ways. You can use a wide angle, wide aperture lens like a 14mm 2.8 and capture the whole thing in one shot, or you can take a series of stitched images with something like a 35mm f1.4 and stitch them together in post to produce the same field of view. But I guarantee you, the stitch shot with the 35mm will have far better noise characteristics due to the larger clear aperture area of that lens in the final image. There's another really important way to mitigate noise in our photography as nature photographers here. So less perhaps as bird and wildlife photographers and more as other kind of photographers, landscapers, nightscapers, macro shooters. And that's the idea of noise averaging. And we can achieve noise averaging in a multitude of different ways. And it's a capture technique. So we've already talked about the possibility to focus stack to reduce noise. That's an averaging technique because we're stacking successive images together, one on top of the other. Now we can do that in different ways too. We can use noise averaging techniques in still scenes and landscapes by taking a series of shots. They don't necessarily need to be focus stacked, and the fact that they're averaged together will necessarily reduce the impact of things like pattern noise that we talked about earlier. Now, there's further techniques. We can use HDR techniques. That's a great way, for instance, for landscape photographers to photograph, because what it can do is expose the different sets of areas in the image. So I'll expose one shot for the shadows, another shot for the midtones, and a third shot for the highlights. And when I combine them together into a single HDR shot, I'm effectively averaging out the noise in the shot. And I'm using the correct exposure for those particular parts of the image to achieve a nice result. Those are all great capture techniques. So let's say we've exhausted all of these strange and adventurous capture techniques and we're faced with a situation where we're just going to encounter noise. We haven't got any other ways to compensate. We can't extend our exposure, we can't raise our ISO or open up our aperture, we can't add light and fill flash. What else can we do? Well, there are a few things we can do. Basically, noise is much less obvious against contrasty and textured backgrounds. So we could frame our subject against a contrasty and textured background, and the noise will be less apparent. But we can go further than that. It's obviously true that there's higher signal information in bright areas of an image. So one way we can reduce noise in an image is just to frame the subject differently against a brighter background. So you might have, for instance, a cheetah sitting near a tree, and you might pull up to that cheetah and frame the cheetah with the tree behind. And you might experience a lot of noise because the trees are dark greeny brown in the background. But if you were to move the vehicle, move forward a little bit, reframe that cheetah and get a more exposed grassy area out behind it, you'll have a brighter background, and that noise will be much less evident. And it's a typical technique that, for instance, perched bird photographers use all the time. Some of them even use artificial backgrounds, actually textured screens behind their setups. So they'll set up a feeder or a water station, and then 5 or 6 meters behind that there'll be an artificial screen, a curtain behind that's bright. And then those photographers might also use a flash as well. That's one way they've reduced or eliminated noise from their images. Now obviously, as a wildlife photographer, field photographer like me, you're not going to be able to go and stick a background out somewhere in the middle of the Kruger Park. But it doesn't mean you can't selectively choose your backgrounds based on the noise characteristics in your image. One of the most important things we can do when we're trying to eliminate noise, reduce noise at capture, is to manage our exposure very carefully. If you think about natural light photography, particularly wildlife photography or nature photography, you're often photographing wildlife and birds in dim conditions, at dusk and dawn. And typically, the camera's metering system is going to want to expose them brighter than the general conditions that you're experiencing at the time. Now, if your intention is to show that exposure at that sort of level of dimness, the same kind of exposure that you actually see with your eyes, the tendency of the camera to overexpose that image is obviously going to suck away at your settings. It's going to, for instance, if you're an adherent of auto ISO, it's going to raise that ISO to compensate for that brighter exposure that it's trying to put into that finished image. So you have to be conscious of that when you take the shots. And typically for me, I do want to show the dim conditions in a lot of situations. I don't necessarily want a super bright image. So I'll actually compensate for that when I meter and take the shot. It's an important consideration, not just to let your camera run away with the settings, because it will introduce more noise. And the same's true for brighter conditions. Your camera is going to try and dull down that exposure, not show the conditions as bright. One has to be aware of that too, although it doesn't really have that many consequences in terms of noise. There's a further way we can manage noise at capture, and it's actually built in to the camera. There's generally two types of noise reduction mechanisms built into many modern cameras, DSLRs, and mirrorless cameras, digital cameras. And one of them is designed to reduce pattern noise, that fixed pattern noise that we've already discussed. And the second method is designed to reduce random noise. And they do it in slightly different ways. Pattern noise is typically quite easy to remove because the camera will recognize those hot pixels, map them, and remove them in the software. So that's quite a good mechanism for reducing pattern noise in a shot. The downside is that the exposure will take almost twice as long because the camera will actually take a dark frame, a frame with no light information in it, immediately after the shot that you take. And the purpose of that is to map out those hot pixels and then remove them from your exposure. The second method uses software and algorithms built into the camera, and its job is to remove random noise, that random noise that we can't really predict, and it needs to use software for that. But I would hesitate to recommend that method because we can do probably a far better job in post-production. At the beginning of the video I said that I didn't want to talk about the post-processing, just eliminating noise at capture. But I do want to point you in the direction of this video because it's a great way of actually eliminating noise post-capture using a really simple workflow. So go check that out. And please, if you do want to know more about this subject, if I haven't bored you to death, then let me know down in the comments, because I've got a lot to share about reducing noise in processing after capture. I think it's really useful information, but obviously it can be pretty dry stuff. Let me know, please, if you're interested, and I'll make a video. See you next time.